Einen schönen guten Abend möchte ich Ihnen wünschen
I would like to welcome you very cordially. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, and welcome to this book introduction of the new book from Tim Jackson, Post-Growth Life After Capitalism. Hello, Tim. Are you here?
I'm with you. Hello, Barbara.
You are with us. Yeah, perfect. Hello. Ja,
it's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. Ja, ich freue mich sehr, dass wir
quite happy that Tim could join us today, and I'm also very happy about the number of applications here for this event. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is great, and I would like to recommend it to you. I will speak in German. And Tim, of course, understands German quite well, but he will reply in English. And for you, we have a simultaneous interpretation. So please make use of the interpreting function at the bottom of your screen. There's this globe where you can see interpreting, and you can select the language that you would like to listen to. And if you would like to listen to the interpretation of Tim Jackson, you can choose German or listen to the original, so you can choose English. Well, I would like to give you the opportunity to ask questions after our approximately 1 hour discussion. So please use the Q&A tool that you can also find at the bottom of your screen. And we will collect questions, but in any case, you have the opportunity to direct questions directly to Tim Jackson. Tim Jackson is widely known in Germany through his book Prosperity Without Growth that he published in 2010. But I would like to say a few sentences ahead of our discussion. Tim Jackson is a professor, he's an economist, and above all, he's one of those who has taught and conducted research at the University of Surrey on sustainability, and he's the author of many articles and books, and amongst others, he has been an advisor to the British government between 2004 and 2011, and based on this advisory work, the book Prosperity Without Growth emerged. Well, Tim, your book, Prosperity Without Growth, that was published in 2010 was actually groundbreaking. Some call it the Bible of growth criticism. And for many people, I think this was a well-funded criticism of our current production and consumerism. And it's also an eye-opener and the starting point for dealing in more detail with our life. If we want to achieve a better life for everyone, we have to exit this growth strategy. So Prosperity Without Growth was actually a global success, and it was translated into 17 different languages. And I'm quite happy and also proud that the Heinrich Böll Foundation contributed to the further spread of the book in other languages. For the Financial Times, this book, Growth Without Prosperity, was actually the book of the year in 2010. And the online magazine UnHerd called it the economic book of the decade in 2019. Well, Tim, with the new book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, you follow up on this statement that we have to live our life in line with the planetary boundaries. This is actually the key element of your new book. And a good life for everyone means that we should not destroy the planet. This is your main thesis, your main statement. But you also raise the question, how can we stop when it's enough? So this is the question that we have to answer as those who are trapped in this growth dilemma, and those who look further into this question, how can we stop when it's enough? And we all know how difficult this question is to answer. My first question to you is, what motivated you after Prosperity Without Growth to follow up on your excellent criticism of capitalism and to write this new book. How do we want to live, is the German title, or post-growth, life after capitalism? So what did you want to add to your previous book?
I think very fondly, actually, back probably almost 11 years, very close to the day when we launched the German translation of Wohlstand ohne Wachstum in Berlin. And the room was packed, and it was one of those occasions where I realized that actually perhaps there's as big or even bigger an audience in Germany for these ideas than there was in my home country, and that journey of Wohlstand ohne Wachstum was an extraordinary one. It began, as you said, as an advice to the UK government. The UK government wasn't that interested in listening to it at the time, but it did find a really surprising audience. And I was, I think, kind of humbled in a way at how many people that spoke to that book and the conversations that it inspired. But it was still, at the end of the day, it was a kind of a policy book. It was written for policymakers. It was making statistical and economic arguments. It wasn't necessarily something that touched an audience outside of that arena, and where it did, it was surprising to find that it did. And what I felt over time, I think over those intervening years, was that there was also a deeper conversation to be had, and a wider conversation, and that was a conversation which wasn't for statisticians, and it wasn't for policymakers, and it wasn't for economists, although it should certainly touch economists. It was for that unexpected audience that Wohlstand ohne Wachstum found back in 2010 and the years that followed it. And it was an audience for whom I felt I wanted to write more, and that I wanted to write in a vein that was less policy oriented and perhaps a little more poetic, accessible, certainly. And that would actually be something that people could read in a way that one doesn't necessarily always read a government report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but ich muss auf Deutsch bleiben, Entschuldigung.
Oh, okay, unfortunately, I have to stick to German. You just said prosperity without growth was meant to be for political decision makers. And I really like about the new book how you touch upon philosophical aspects and also the history of certain ideas in your book, in particular when it comes to the question how far in our economic history, but also throughout our whole history of ideas, are linked to this myth of growth. And amongst others, you describe how much competition is based on Darwin's interpretation of nature, or is confused with that, and in how far the Darwinian narrative actually marks the economic thinking. For example, you write nature as a fight, consumerism as unsatiable behavior. And this is actually an expression of capitalism based on Darwin. So I like that because you describe quite well that we are too much focused on this Darwinian thinking in our economies, this narrative that everyone has to fight against everyone. So this is actually persisting. And in your book, you also describe, like the biologist Margulis, that this one-sided description of evolution is wrong or not adequate. And I would like to ask you, why do we not succeed in coming over these narratives that are based on the evolution theory of Darwin? Why can't we go beyond that? Why do we continue to think in these kind of categories of fighting, of competition, even though this is not really happening in nature, or not exclusively happening?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, but I think to some extent it goes to, a long cultural history Darwin's ideas were explosive in the middle of the 19th century, and they were particularly damaging, actually, for a kind of late version of a religious theology that was on its last legs. It was trying to sort of prop up the idea of God for the 19th century, with a set of ideas and notions that actually were not up to the job. They had no answers through conventional religion for the kinds of questions that people wanted to ask about, why good people suffer, why things don't always work out for the best, and indeed, what form of society we would like to be living in. And the answers that religion brought, actually, I think, were in some sense ripe to be attacked by the new theory, the evolutionary theory that Darwin brought to us. But it was, at the same time, it was a theory that had its social context in the early industrial revolution, which was a competitive place, a place where actually poor people were losing their livelihoods, where the quality of life was poor, where life expectancy was low, where the countryside was being hollowed out in favor of factories in the city. And Darwin, interestingly, kind of borrowed that social context to create his metaphor for what nature is. And nature became, red in tooth and claw. It became this intensely competitive view of what's going on that then became the justification for our economics. And our economics became the basis for our society. And there we were, trapped in a culture that had lost its way from the old religious faiths and found a new faith in a partisan view of nature and of our own human nature as well. And those things then, through capitalism, I think, began to be deeply ingrained in our society, and indeed in the way that we think about our society, so that it's almost impossible within that culture, in fact, to free ourselves from the power of those ideas and to see the other side of the coin. And that's exactly what Lynn Margulis did, which is why it's such a powerful, inspiring story of a biologist looking at nature and saying, hang on, guys, and it was guys she was talking to, you've got this slightly wrong. There's a huge collaboration going on, and it's been going on in evolutionary history. And you can't just look at this with your capitalistic lens and ignore the reality of the science that I, as a scientist, am looking at. And it was an extraordinary story. Her paper was submitted to and rejected from something like 15 or 16 different journals before it was finally accepted. And then 10 years later, it was in the canons of biological science. And it's a story of vision, and it's a story of a powerful sense of bringing that vision to life within a scientific context and challenging our beliefs, challenging ourselves.
Ja, danke schön. Noch einmal die Frage, dieses Framing, Wettbewerb, Konkurrenz.
Thank you very much. Once again, I would like to talk about this framing, this Darwinian theory. Why is the narrative, this framing, so persistent as you describe it in your book? Why does it stick with us? I learned it at school. And what needs to happen if we want to come over these narratives that we are taught, which characterize our infrastructures, our economic infrastructures? What do we need? What is necessary to overcome these old narratives being embedded in this kind of thinking?
Ich denke, das ist der neue Kampf. Das ist der Kampf, in dem wir uns gegenwärtig befinden. Und das ist auch der Kampf, den Lynn Margulis beschrieben hat. Wir dürfen aber nicht vergessen, wie mächtig solche Dinge sind. Wir haben Institutionen geschaffen, die Wettbewerb fördern. Angefangen von den Schulen bis hinein in die akademischen Institutionen, bis hin in die Finanzinstitutionen, in unsere Regierungssysteme hinein. Und das ist etwas, was man nicht einfach über Nacht wieder loswerden kann, entflechten kann. Und das kommt zurück auf die erste Frage: Was will ich mit diesem Buch erreichen, was ich mit Wohlstand ohne Wachstum nicht erreichen konnte? Ich wollte tiefer eindringen in diese Wertesysteme und warum es so schwer ist, diese Verschiebung hinzubekommen. Wir müssen natürlich zunächst erst einmal darüber nachdenken, wie sieht unsere Kultur aus? Und das sind die Wurzeln, die wir angehen müssen, um uns befreien zu können und eine andere Funktionsweise der Welt zu schaffen. Do you see any way how we can do this unfunctionalizing?
Social enterprise. Social enterprise, for example, is a structure of enterprise which is very, very different from the normal competitive way of thinking about things. Impact investment is a very different way of thinking about, venture capital. These are already initiatives that are beginning to change our sense of culture, but we still have to, I think, do that hard work of untangling exactly how that metaphor of competition became so deeply entrenched in our lives. And we have to begin to give ourselves the chance and the spaces through which we can find different metaphors. And I should say, for all the skeptics online who are listening to this and thinking, well, this is all, fine and rosy and fluffy, let's talk about collaboration and hug each other, that this is not to deny the existence of competition. It is rather to point out to the fact that these two forces of competition and collaboration actually in nature and in our own psychology have always been there. They've been part of our evolution, and they should be and must be part of how we think about society.
Ja, das beschreibst du auch schön in diesem Buch, dass es nicht darum
Yes, you described that very aptly. You're saying, of course, it's not about abolishing competition altogether. Competition will always be there. But over many centuries, we have neglected cooperation, also as far as nature is concerned. And we have marginalized those ideas. Another framing that you have dealt with, and many other researchers did this as well, it's the dogma of the GDP, which is the measure of prosperity, the only measure that we use to measure prosperity. It is something that developed only in a recent history in the 40s and 50s. Only at that time, GDP became the yardstick. What do you think about that today? What is your assessment of the GDP as a measure? Would you say yes to a degrowth in the form of a shrinking GDP in order to reduce environmental destruction? Or would you rather say we have to focus less on growth and focus on other societal goals? Shouldn't we focus on the GDP anymore? Just do whatever we want to do and need to do.
Subtitle of the book is Wachstum is about Wachstumswahn. It's about a kind of fetish with this number, this economic growth number, and I think that's in a way what we need to let go. I've always felt, and particularly as an economist, that the GDP, the BIP, is a useful tool for understanding the relationship between different bits of the economy, but it is not in itself a good measure or a target for where we should be heading. It's not a good measure of social progress. I start the book with that story, which is quite familiar to people who have critiqued the GDP now, of Robert Kennedy and turning up on his first campaign speech in that ill-fated campaign of 1968 and beginning to, talking in the middle of the Vietnam War, in the middle of the civil rights actions and riots that were happening across campuses in town, and talking to those students about the GDP, about the BIP. And you kind of think, what on earth is going on there, that this man, this presidential candidate is talking about something arcane like this number? And I think, for those who've worked critiquing the GDP, that Robert Kennedy speech is a kind of poster speech. It's one of those things that we hold up and say, look, it's not just us saying this, it's Robert Kennedy back in 1968. But what goes missing from that understanding, and what I wanted to bring back into the book in a way, was that actually, Kennedy's speech in 1968 was not just about measurement. It was about value, and it was about the ways in which we placed values around measurements and then lost our way because we weren't looking at the right things. And I think that remains the case. And I'm not saying that we throw away the measurement itself of the GDP, but it is not a good indicator of progress. And economists have known that for a very, very long time. So placing it at the heart of your policies distracts you from what matters. It distracts you from remaining within your carbon budget, for example. It distracts you from what's happening to the mental health of your children. It distracts you from the destruction that you're wreaking on the habitats of other species. And that's not something that we can afford to do either as a society or indeed as a government. And so government has to have, it seems to me, it has to get rid of, has to find its way out of this Wachstumswahn, this growth fetish.
Mhm. Wege aus dem Wachstumswahn, ja, das ist der Untertitel.
Yes, Wege aus dem Wachstumswahn is the German subtitle, Life After Capitalism. Maybe you can say a few words about the book in order to explain to the reader what for you would be the most important ways out of this focus on growth, not just talking about CO2 emissions. What do you think we need to do in order to think in different ways? How do we can get out of this trap that we are in?
You know, I think to me, the kind of deep message of the book, if you like, and it's not one that immediately lends itself to policy prescriptions, but is a really important part of the process, is something that, you know, Hannah Arendt said, and she's another of my characters in the book. And you know, in the Human Condition, which is a wonderful book. I forget, it's not called The Human Condition in German. It's called Vita Activa in German. And what she does in the beginning of that book is really sort of say, you know, we've lost the power of thinking about our own culture and ourselves within that culture, and we need to retrieve that process of interrogating our culture, that process of thinking about what we're doing, is absolutely critical in the struggle against oppression, in the struggle against injustice, in the struggle against totalitarianism. If we're not prepared to dig deep and find the roots of those systemic problems within what we're doing, then we cannot expect to find easy answers, and perhaps there aren't easy answers. But that process of thinking, you know, that to me is step one of Wege aus dem Wachstumswahn. That's you know, actually to begin to understand exactly how we've tied ourselves into these dependencies, and it's from that understanding that we can then begin to see how to escape. And the escape route itself, again, is not so much about policy, I think. It is as much about value. It's about expressing our vision for a future that we want. It's about holding in the frame the concepts of social justice and environmental protection, and looking at where we have let those concepts go, not just in our policy, but in our science and in our everyday lives. And in the process of doing that, that's when these Wege, these ways out of the growth fetish, begin to appear before us. But we have to go into the darkness of the wood before we can see the ways out of it.
Ja, du sagst ja auch, für dich ist zum Beispiel
You've said post-growth for you is just a term, a buzzword. And you say in your book that we need to think more thoroughly. We need to think about why we have ignored other ways to foster equality. Maybe you can say a few words about post-growth. And why do you say that post-growth is just a term, is just one way that we need to lean on when we think about ways out?
To be at the moment, because it confronts what is so deep inside us, a culture that's deep inside us, a set of rules, of norms that are deep inside us, a way of being that's deep inside us. And if we're not able to confront that, then it is difficult to enter that dark place that I was describing and see the ways out of it. And so I see, you know, I see that as being an essential place to be, that narrative around post-growth and degrowth, and confronting growth, and particularly confronting economic growth as an idea. I see that as a sort of essential starting point, but its usefulness is also its problem, because it's still kind of confronting the old society, the old civilization, in the language of that civilization and that society. And it's, in doing so, it's actually, and I've found this quite a lot since Wohlstand ohne Wachstum was published, that it sets up confrontations with people who are almost religiously clinging to the idea of growth, and those who are almost religiously opposing the idea of growth. And in the process, that space for conversation begins to disappear. And I think, for me, the post-growth language is a slightly more open, forgiving place to do what's necessary here, which is to think about the fact that we are moving out of that growth-based situation anyway, particularly in the advanced economies, to think about the historical contingency of this period of extraordinary economic growth driven by capitalism, and to think about how we can reconfigure some of the economics that we might need in a post-growth context. So I like to frame the kind of real scientific economics work that we're doing at the University of Surrey, for example, in the language of post-growth economics, because we don't have one. We are living in macroeconomics that was built in the 1930s, and it was built around the concept of growth, and it has not questioned that underlying assumption since. And so that to me speaks of a deep necessity to create something that's different. And for the moment, post-growth is as good a label as any to be working under, but it's not the destination. It's not the kind of vision of where we're going, and its resonance in terms of attacking the growth paradigm is also the weakness that it isn't providing its own light shining into the future. It's interesting, actually, Wie wollen wir leben was published as post-growth, just that, in English. And the conversation with that itself has its own sort of historical story behind it. The reason the publisher approached me to do something around post-growth and where the debates were and so on, and when Ercom and yourselves actually picked it up and sort of said, this doesn't necessarily translate quite so well, post-Wachstum in German, it doesn't resonate quite so well, and we were looking around for a different kind of title. And I pay homage here to my friend Willi Gessner, who came up. He was the person who came up with Wie wollen wir leben. And as a man with a philosophical background, the book spoke to his interest in those kind of underlying philosophical ideas, which were really asking that fundamental question. This to me, I prefer the title of this book in German.
Me too.
To the one in English, because it is what the book is asking.
Absolut. Schön, dass du diese Geschichte erzählst.
Absolutely, it's good to tell that story. I think the title, How Do We Want to Live, the German translation of that title, is exactly what this book is all about. On the one hand side, this book deconstructs the situation that we are in. Where do we come from? What are the narratives? What are the traps? And then the book is open-minded enough in order to look for ways out. You do not pretend that you already know all the answers about how we want to live. But let me ask my next questions, and let me here focus on how you feel about it. I mean, we are going through a very severe pandemic. Some countries are still in the middle of the pandemic, and the answers to the pandemic and the economic consequences are resonating as growth, growth, growth. We all want to have a start, a new start, and a new start meaning new answers instead of just repeating the old answers. What is your take on that? Are we missing major opportunities? Are we not preparing for a new economy right now?
I think in a sense, it's another insight from Arendt, actually, her concept of natality this idea that new things happen in the world all the time, however much we try to keep them the same, because things are changing and new generations are coming and new ideas are coming, they spring up and they change things. We always have chances. The question about the pandemic, the pandemic is a really important one. And clearly, actually, I mean, I was writing it during lockdown, most of the book. So whether I intended to or not, which I didn't originally, because the concept of the book predated the pandemic, whether I wanted to or not, inevitably my reflections in the writing were reflections on what was happening at that particular point in time. And of those reflections, the most profound, I think, was this sense that, for me, prosperity is as much about health as it is about wealth. And that's that, as I began to, I mean, people have talked about that. John Ruskin said there is no wealth but life, and Thomas Jefferson said the care of human life and happiness and not its destruction is the first and only task of government. This idea actually that health matters to us was brought home to us very, very clearly through the pandemic. And although that seems a kind of trivial insight, I think it turns out to be quite profound when you think about what health is, because ultimately, if prosperity is about wealth, then you can think about accumulation as the roots to prosperity. You can think about growth and having more, because wealth is something that you accumulate and that grows. If you think about prosperity as health, you are in a different place, because health is primarily about balance, a balance between too little and too much. And that concept, and it goes all the way back to Aristotle's interpretation of the good life, in fact, is something that completely changes your outlook on how you think about what society should be doing, how you think about what you should be doing as an individual, and what you think about how the economy should be managed as well. And the second insight that came again on the back of that, is that those people who were absolutely instrumental to allowing us to maintain the balance of good health were the ones who capitalism had neglected for decades and decades, whose wages were low, whose livelihoods were insecure, who bore the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic, and actually turned out to be the most important people in society. And that's something, that for a while, during the pandemic, when we applauded the nurses from our doorsteps and our balconies, that we had that in our sights. And the one thing that I guess, my post-pandemic work, if that's where we are, would like to hold on to is that idea, that single idea that actually, if prosperity is about health, the economy should be around care, and creating an economy of care is the task that we have to dedicate ourselves to as we think about this building back out of the pandemic. And I think my sense of that is that it resonates with ordinary people in a way that let's get growth back just doesn't, and it resonates with people for the very simple reason that those lessons were profound, and they remain with us and will remain with us at least for the next few years. And as we work ourselves through what just happened, the tragedy of it, the lessons from it, what we lost, and also sometimes what we gained, that staying with that process of thinking about where we are, thinking about what we've just been through, is the place where those chances for something different still exist.
Ja, ich kann das sehr gut nachvollziehen.
Well, I can fully understand what you just said. And I do share the fact that social innovation in our societies emerge. Creativity is very active and emerges, but still it is a tragedy from my point of view that the answer or the reply to the pandemic is once again that it even increases imbalances through the billions and trillions that the governments are putting into the financial circles in order to slow down the consequences and the impact of the pandemic. So isn't it frustrating for you when you see that?
Absolutely infuriating, particularly particularly in the early days of the pandemic, when there was an immediate rush to support the value of financial shares on the stock market, and people profited from that enormously by the ways that governments put money into the economy to protect the value of those assets, at the same time as people's livelihoods, ordinary people's livelihoods, were under the most severe threat in the world. What I find absolutely, frustrating, infuriating, but also somehow extraordinarily puzzling, that actually the reaction to that I think we should have seen has not yet materialized. After the financial crash, we had, Occupy Wall Street, we had Los Indignados in Spain, we had a sense of uprising, we had rethinking economics, we had students turning up at their professors' classes putting a notice on the door saying, we're boycotting your classes till you talk about what matters. Where is that reaction? And it could be that we are, it's still too early days. But it seems to me that when you look at the reality of what happened through the pandemic, and where money went through the pandemic and where it didn't go, and then how quickly we forgot how important care workers were to us when it came to remunerating them at a decent rate, that is frustrating. It's angering, and to me, and perhaps I'm clutching at straws here to save myself from that sense of frustration. But to me, it is not something that speaks of social continuity. You cannot do that to a society for a very long time without that blowing back in your face. And so I think, and I see to some extent in the way that, we have begun to protest again about the things that governments are not doing for us, and that will eventually move into that sort of sense of protest. Having said that, I suppose, Barbara, that I would also say that there were some things about that situation that lifted the veil from the mystery of government finance and from money itself, the ways that actually governments could find that money, the ways they could move that money, the ways they could intervene in supply chains, the ways that they could protect health by building hospitals and bringing more nurses into the profession. That lesson, again, is one of those things that we should not be forgetting. And Will, I think that has finally blown out of the water the idea that governments have no role in the money system itself, and no legitimacy in terms of using the monetary system to support the well-being of their citizens. And that, I think, that too will be one of the lessons that will turn out to be a good thing. You may say that I'm just looking for ways to avoid being as frustrated as obviously it's very easy to be.
Wir könnten sicherlich
well, I think we could go into more detail or go in more depth in terms of the pandemic. We had short-term work in Germany and Europe in order to prevent more people from being unemployed. So there were some good reactions there, but what should really be kept in mind by us, and we also discussed this with Alan Tooze, the economist, is that we indebted ourselves throughout the pandemic considerably. And you yourself wrote an open letter together with others, which is directed at the European Union. And you asked for a stop to an austerity drive as a consequence, because these austerity drives actually have the repercussions that we all know, that we've already seen during the financial crisis. So with more money, or let me put it differently, when we say we need more government spending, then it should also lead to more wealth, but at the same time, it also stirs more growth. So also the neo-Keynesian policy means that the government spends and invests into climate, social cohesion, etc. So how do you address that? On the one hand, to sign such a letter, which is actually promoting government spending, but on the other hand, you also know that this is not fully in line with your visions in order to limit growth, or can you bring this in line?
Solid, sewn up answer to that, but I can't entirely, because actually I think the jury is still out. It's still not entirely clear that Keynesian idea that government creates stimulus through its spending is in fact the only outcome of governments controlling, at least having a better control of the money system. To me, it depends a lot where that money goes in society. And if you're putting that money into investments which increase the productivity of the economy in conventional terms, then yes, that stimulus creates growth. But if you're putting that investment into the protection of habitats, into better wages for nurses, into the building of hospitals, into the building of a care sector, into the creativity and the craft sector, these are sectors which traditionally actually do not have the high productivity growth rates that a classic Keynesian stimulus is looking for. And so to me, actually, there is a way of bringing those two things together, that idea that we are calling, and we are definitely calling, and I think it's important to be calling not for austerity, because austerity is a deeply punishing policy regime that benefits actually the most well-off in society and punishes those who are least well-off. And I've not any problem at all with calling for something against austerity, because I think it would be disastrous at this point in time. And the steerage away from austerity, though, is not, in my view, necessarily a steering back to growth in that conventional sense. It's not steering us back towards high productivity. It's not steering us back towards more consumption and production. It should be steering us, and government has the potential for it to steer us towards this care economy that I'm talking about. And in doing so, actually, you bring together both the government's critical role in the money system and the sense of moving towards a post-growth environment.
Na gut, auf einer ähnlichen Achse liegt die Debatte darum, dass wir
the debate about the Green Deal is
oder auch in den USA
a similar topic, or also in the US. First of all, governments try to reduce the emissions by 2050. So these are actually investments into non-fossil or carbon-free industry, for example, in hydrogen. And these are investments that will also generate growth. So do you think that this growth is okay if it's the right growth?
Some of those technological investments in particular will, and particular technological investments where you're investing in energy technologies which are already cheaper and better investments than coal-fired or oil-fired technologies. So some of those places will generate some growth. And of course, in an economy which is driven by burning fossil fuels, if you want to replace those fossil fuels, you're going to have to find an industry, a sector of energy, the renewable energy sector, which is going to see some growth. And that's not in itself a bad thing. And it may not be a bad thing if that leads to something of a stabilization of the economy at the macroeconomic level as well. What is bad is seeing, and I think this is the problem in a sense with the kind of concepts of green growth, and sometimes it's implicit in the Green New Deal as well, is this sense that all we have to do is shift fossil fuels to renewables. They're much better anyway. We'll get richer, we'll get bigger, we'll have a faster growing economy than the economy we had before. And first of all, that is not going to solve the problems that aren't about carbon. And second of all, if you're doing that investment right, if you're really moving towards a green economy, you are not just looking at technology, you're looking at skills, sectors that you want, and look at the carbon footprints of those sectors. And I know I'm kind of coming back to this point, I'm slightly laboring the points in a sense, but actually the carbon footprint of the healthcare sector and of service-based sectors, the sectors that enrich our lives, those carbon footprints are much, much lower than the production and consumption-based footprints of the traditional sectors. So that if you think about the Green New Deal as a shift towards a low carbon economy, a green economy, and you think about those green sectors actually in terms of the sectors that we've been talking about, the ones that protect our lives, improve the quality of our lives, allow for creativity, what you find is they're very labor intensive and they're very low in carbon. And that shift is a much more sophisticated way, to me, of thinking about the Green New Deal than the Green New Deal as a stimulus program that is pushing its money into new technologies in order to promote more growth. It's a very thin, it's out of date. It goes back to a logic that might have worked in the 1930s when the New Deal was being talked about by Keynes and Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's not a philosophy that is fit for purpose for us now.
Ja, du weißt ja, wie sehr ich auch deine Kritik an der grünen
Well, you know, I do share your criticism of the green economy, as long as the green economy does not include the whole life cycle, as long as investment is not human rights based. For me, the term climate neutrality suggests that the only thing we need to do is prevent CO2 emissions, and then we can get out of all the other multiple crises. That for me is an important topic. We will not solve the crisis of biodiversity loss, and we cannot just simply pour money into finite technologies. So I think it is all about being more holistic and also looking at the social standards. You also deal with nutrition in your book. Maybe you can say something about nutrition. What is important when you think of nutrition?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a theme that comes with the idea and the motif, if you like, of prosperity as health. If prosperity is about health, then nourishment matters to us. And there, to me, there are the various aspects to that. Perhaps the most blunt, if you like, is the sense in which, and it came home to me very, very starkly from this extraordinary statistic from the World Health Authority, the World Health Organization, that more people today die from overconsumption than die from undernutrition. And that's just extraordinary in a sense. We have diseases of affluence that are killing more people than the diseases of poverty. And to me, it is a direct consequence of a system that does not recognize the place where balance lies. Having too little nourishment is disastrous. It's disastrous for your health, for your development as a child, for your well-being in not just physical but in mental ways. Having too much can be equally disastrous, and we are beginning to discover that in these diseases of affluence. So in that sense, this idea that nourishment matters comes directly from that simple physical analogy of prosperity as health, and recognizing that even in something as basic as food, that balance becomes absolutely critical. And it's also, interestingly, it's one of those places where people can do this for themselves. They can understand that dynamic for themselves. They can recognize actually that they are, at least in principle, they can recognize that, what's good in terms of nourishment and what's bad and too much in terms of nourishment. And they can bring that sense of balance back into their own individual life. But what we also know is that in a society that is systematically pushing people towards poor diets, excessive consumption, and systematically exposing them to fast foods and foods that have too much sugar and saturated fat, that we have within us, and it goes back to evolution in a sense, we have an evolutionary urge to eat that stuff. And it comes from a point in time at which it was very, very scarce. We couldn't find that much refined sugar. We couldn't find that much saturated fat. And so actually, you know, that's built into our DNA, that urge to have more and more of that kind of nourishment. And that was okay at a time when it wasn't being shoved under our noses and down our throats as fast as possible in order to make profits for fast food companies and supply chains. And so it's a way of thinking through how that structure of capitalism continually pushes us out of balance, even in something as basic as food.
Ja, aber da sind wir genau bei der Frage. Also für mich ist...
That brings me precisely to the question. I mean,
ungesunde Ernährung,
unhealthy foods, unhealthy nutrition, that is something that is made by those who are interested in selling stuff, selling empty calories, if you will. And that also brings us to the question of policy making. For me, that's the question of policy failure, political failure, that people
mit dieser Sorte von Fehlernährung überhaupt konfrontiert werden. Von daher nochmal.
Do not have a healthy diet anymore. So the question to you is, what do policymakers have to do in order to get us into a proper balance again, instead of just allowing things to happen?
Actually, very, very interestingly, our own Prime Minister, who I know is very, very popular in Europe, and was in hospital with COVID and came out of COVID almost on a mission, actually, because it had struck him. And the evidence is also very clear that obesity and overweight has a high correlation with COVID mortality. And so, you know, he came out of that situation actually determined to kind of try and do something about it, and has begun to think in those terms. Now, it seems to me if a politician like Boris Johnson can understand that, it can't be that hard for politicians to understand. And so,
Bolsonaro I think, didn't understand.
Sorry?
Bolsonaro in Brazil didn't understand.
Bolsonaro didn't understand. Absolutely. No, I mean, it is okay. So we have varieties of politicians, some of whom may be able to understand if we're lucky, and that's clearly not good enough. I mean, I think my point, I'm basically kind of agreeing. I absolutely agree with you. You know, at the individual level, it's possible to take control of that situation and find the balance for yourself. In a society that's continually pushing you in the wrong direction, you know very well that the distribution curve is going to shift in the wrong direction, and only government can really do something about that. And so, you know, the incentives not to sell fast food, the advertising that stimulates that desire, the constant accessibility of it, the economic incentives that support a fast food industry that's destroying the health of our kids. All of this is a legitimate focus for government. And without it, of course, you know, you're left with just social marketing and media campaigns say, hey guys, you know, we know you're surrounded, your kids in the candy shop, but we didn't put you in here to have the candy. We only put you in here to look at it and then walk out again. That's not going to work, you know, ultimately. And at the epidemiological level, at the societal level, that intervention by government, I think, is crucial.
Danke, Tim. Ich habe zu diesem Thema
Tim, as far as power is concerned, I have an interesting question that I have received via our chat. There's a person, the name of which I can't read right now, who asks that in economic study, there is a central missing category that deals with power and interests. That person in our audience asks, in our vision of a post-growth system, how much redistribution do we need? How can we bring about an economic democracy? How central does economic democracy have to be? What do you think about power and redistribution for us to arrive in a post-growth world?
First, because in a sense, distribution becomes absolutely paramount when you're in that post-growth world. If the cake is getting bigger and bigger, you can afford to give more people bigger slices and keep the same slice that you had yourself. If the cake stays the same, then you then have to think about the fair distribution of that wealth. And that, that to me is absolutely clear. And of course, the link to power is incredibly important. Now, I suppose what I would say about the way that I approach the question of power in the book is that it's very similar to the way that I approached many of the other questions by, kind of not rushing to policy solutions, but beginning to understand how the dynamics of power interact with the dynamics of government and how our systems of democracy have navigated that over a period through which capitalism has essentially captured many of those processes, and that power rests in terms of the owners of capital, and that influences the structures of power in ways that prevent us from this equitable distribution, this sense of justice and social justice that is so critical. And so my chapter on power, I guess I do a couple of things in the chapter, and one is to argue that that it has been written into our political philosophies from the moment we started thinking about political governance, that the legitimacy of government exists only for as long as government is representing the interests even of the worst off in society. And that beyond that point, and again, it's written into our political philosophies, there is a right, and some of those philosophers would also even say a responsibility for civil disobedience, and the civil disobedience of the kind that we have begun to see around climate change. And actually, Extinction Rebellion activists, for example, are quite articulate about the political legacy of the concept of civil disobedience. It goes right back to writings in the 16th and 17th century about what government is and what government should do, how far it's legitimate, how far it's not. And so that's one of the ways in which I grapple with this question of power. And I'm not suggesting it's an easy one at all, but it's one of the ways to sort of say, and I kind of end up in a position where I'm sort of saying, actually, we have stopped thinking about what government is and what government should be. We've stopped thinking at the point at which we thought we had representative democracy that was reflecting the interests of everyone. We need to go on with that process. We need to be thinking better, more deeply about this kind of process, because it has led us to the point where we're looking at civil disobedience, and that's a reflection of the failure of power inside government. So that's, kind of one of the ways that I address the question. And then the other, which is a kind of, it may seem a little odd in respect to that, but it's in a way thinking about how power is construed in ourselves. And I draw actually on the work of the Vietnamese monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, who has a wonderful book called The Art of Power, where what he does is he kind of contrasts two very, very different forms of power. One is this power of craving and accumulating goods and wealth and status. And the other is a power which he suggests, and it's a sort of, an internal concept from the roots of Buddhism, if you like, the power of a different kind rests in us as individuals all the time, irrespective of our wealth, status, and power. And sometimes these two things actually are diametrically opposed to each other. And through that contrast of power, I kind of weave an analysis which to some extent is a sort of extraordinary one, because in looking at these two types of power, I was drawn to something which I just find fascinating, which is that that capitalism and Buddhism basically start in the same place. They start from the precept, the premise that life is about struggle and suffering. And capitalism says, well, life's about struggle and suffering, so you have to compete to survive, and you do that as fast and as furiously as you possibly can to hope that you don't end up at the bottom of the pile. And in doing so, you evade suffering. And Buddhism says, no, that is completely arse about tit. It's the wrong way up. It's actually, in pursuing that, you are succumbing to the suffering that you're trying to evade. And it takes a diametrically opposed prescription that the way towards escaping suffering is to turn towards that suffering, to never run away from it, to never put it behind your back, to never put it outside the remit of government. And those two ideas actually come together in the sense that we have not stopped. We have not come to the end point of understanding how we should govern society. And we have to actually engage in that task with a sense of the depth of the problem that we're dealing with if we're to overcome these perverse dynamics of power that are preventing change.
Ja, Tim, ich mag das sehr gerne, wie du...
Tim, I like it how you discuss these basic philosophical questions and connect this to how we want to live and the economic aspects. So this is actually a big strength of the book. So in these different dimensions, you reflect on the situation. I mean, it's always also about, think about ourselves. We are part of a power system. We also have power over others, and we should not only point at others. But still, Tim, I have very many questions in the chat by our audience, which focus on exactly this topic. How can we get out of this growth-oriented economy? How can we go towards a post-growth economy without first having to face this major catastrophe? Many people have the impression that we are actually participating in a race, that we are destroying this planet, but on the other hand, we are unable to find the right path, except for green technology, for example, or the same kind of economic behavior that brought us here. So maybe you can cater for the desire of our audience to show once again where we should go from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, in a sense, this was the task that I was partly engaged in Wohlstand ohne Wachstum,
Yes.
and in the years since, and in the various incarnations, particularly Das Update, which was published, I think, in German in 2017 or
2017.
Yeah, genau. Und and I was quite prescriptive about the kinds of changes, and I think the changes, I think if you think about the problem in terms of economics has gone wrong, then a part of the solution at least has to be in looking at the concepts that economics uses and reformulating them, making them fit for purpose, looking at the way that enterprise works, for example, and asking, what should enterprise be instead of a kind of system of profit maximization through the mass production of material goods that are thrown away as fast as possible? What if enterprise is conceived as service? And there you begin to look at what you need in order to protect enterprise as service, the kinds of financial structures that you need, the kind of ownership structures that you need, the kind of incentive structures that you need in order for service-based, socially oriented, community-built, sustainable enterprises to survive. And those are all very, very practical, pragmatic tasks. You can, you can set a whole bunch of policies, you can enshrine them in legislation, and of course you have to campaign for them as well, because those changes are unlikely to happen without that movement towards them. And likewise, I would say, in something like investment. I mean, investment, what do we think of when we think of investment? We think of the financial crisis. We think of gambling casinos. We think of winner takes all. We think of a process through the rich get richer, as we were talking about before, even through human tragedy. And actually, that is a complete travesty of the concept of investment in economics. And for the chapter which I talk about, actually, investment in post-growth, I went to a completely different analogy. I went to the life and the example of Wangari Maathai, who founded the Green Belt. Planting trees, getting poor rural women in sub-Saharan Africa to plant trees. And it is a fantastic analogy, a metaphor for what investment really is. It's about taking the time and the resources now to create things that will last and produce prosperity into the future. And that idea of investment as a commitment to the future is, again, something that you can work towards, that you can build from, that you can create your architecture around, that you can regulate your financial markets for, that you can create the space for in the way that you build change. So these, I'm not suggesting they're going to happen overnight. They're not. They are the struggle. They are the places where we have to campaign, where we have to talk about the rights of ownership and the distribution of ownership, where we have to talk about the incentive structures that motivate city traders to create as much wealth for a few people as possible. And we have to have, a sense of motion in all of these directions. But the benefits of that, it seems to me, is actually that you first of all, you have a sense of a direction to go in. You have a sense of where the action needs to be. Second of all, you actually return a kind of coherence to our sense of what enterprise is. Enterprise has got a bad rap, particularly because of big institutional enterprises, transnational enterprises, or enormously powerful enterprises that pay very little in the way of taxes, that don't look after their workers, that create products that destroy the planet with no comeuppance whatsoever. And actually, that is not a nice place to be inside, even if you're an entrepreneur. Suppose you could create a sense of enterprise where you wanted to be an entrepreneur, where in fact, your rewards were social rewards, where you were a valued member of society and not someone that is constantly trying to fight off the disapproval of your own peers. These are ways of thinking that are both practical, pragmatic, but also return us to a sense of vision. And of course, what I was doing in post-growth was mostly about the vision.
Right.
But for all of those people who want prescriptions,
ja,
I think Wollen
ja,
und Wachstum is still out there somewhere.
Ich würde auch sagen, wir empfehlen heute nochmal.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that we definitely recommend Wealth Without Growth, and also the update. I mean, there is the update Growth Without Prosperity Without Growth from 2017, also supported or published by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, or with the help of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. It's much more precise than what you just said. Where do we have to rethink? Where do we have to change our actions, produce lesser, consume fewer things? And the new book, Post-Growth, is much more a vision, and it's also a book on the question, how do we actually want to embed our thinking into the narratives that capitalism tells us continuously, and how can we eventually get out of this? So in the first book, you talked about this metal casing of consumerism. And I think in the second book, you wanted to say that there are also other steel casings than just the production and consumer patterns, and that we have to be liberated here. But still, I'm afraid people still want to know from you, what are your 5 main recommendations for the new German government? I'm sure you are closely following or monitoring the German political scene, and you know that we have coalition negotiations. So what do you think should not be repeated? What could be a new thing or a visionary thing for a new government? I mean, we're always talking about visions and
I do follow it a little bit. I wouldn't say that I was kind of an expert in it. And obviously there's quite a lot up for grabs at the moment in terms of what that government is going to be. But I don't know how I managed to do this, but I did accidentally become a kind of commentator on German politics through an interview that I gave about post-growth, and it was a German interview, and she asked me, what did I think about the election and the rise of the Greens, and I ended up saying something which was kind of quoted across the tabloids, I think, as I understand it, about how good it would be if the Greens had a strong role in the new government, and how that would create actually could create a new sense of leadership in Europe. And I think, although that was a very throwaway comment, as I think about that, I do feel as though Germany has occupied an absolutely critical place in the European project, in the project of the European Union. And it also has a position of power in that project, and has had that position of power in the project. And I think, this may be a little bit kind of tricky to take, but it has also been criticized for its position of power in that project, in setting up some of the architecture of things, for example, like the monetary system, that ends up protecting the advantages that Germany has as a country with a primary export surplus over countries in poorer parts of Europe, which do not have that luxury. And the monetary system sits in the middle of this, and in particular the euro currency, preventing those poorer countries from actually finding a way out of those difficult situations and keeping Germany in a relatively luxurious position. So if you ask me what progressive leadership in Germany looks like at this point in time, I see a clear role for a moral leadership. And I see that moral leadership not just in relation to green issues, but I see it in relation to social issues. I don't think Germany will be successful in its leadership on the green issues unless it pays attention to those social issues. And those social issues are being played out through financial and institutional structures at the heart of the European project, which are not functional and have to some extent been part of the fracturing that eventually, amongst other things, led to the departure of my own country from the European Union. So that's, it's not a comfortable message, and shoot me down by all means, but in a sense, what I'm arguing for is the legitimacy of Germany to play that moral and social role and that leadership role that it is in the position of being able to do, and to ask, those critical questions about not just the best interests of the citizens of Germany, but actually the best interest of the citizens of Europe. And I would love, and it's the biggest criticism that you could make of my position, I would love for my country to be playing that role too. But, that for now is foreclosed. And so I turn to Germany with hope.
Hört sich an wie ein gutes Schluss.
This sounds like a good concluding remark, actually. I mean, you are looking at Germany with hope. The Greens, you said, or the new government should take a leading role in terms of morals, but this is not sufficient from my point of view. I mean, it's important, but not sufficient, I would say, because we are in the middle of a debate how our country can organize cohesion, how our country can fight against imbalances. And I'm not so overly happy about what I've heard so far from the coalition negotiations, because sometimes in Germany we tend, in this case with the liberals at the table, to debate the austerity drives or the debt brake. And I hope that we will invest in climate protection, in social cohesion, that we have a different migration policy in the future. I mean, if this succeeds, I am on your side. Well, I hope so too. I hope it for you and also for us, actually. This would be great. Yes, of course. And your country announced today that they would like to solve the energy problem with nuclear power, and France already did the same. They announced that they would want to enhance nuclear power in order to stick to the climate goals. And this, of course, cannot be turned back in Germany. So the withdrawal from nuclear power is finalized. and it's ongoing for several years already, but it also shows what you've just said. The important thing is to see how we defend ourselves against powerful interests, how we show civil disobedience at all levels, that there are political movements, grassroots movements like Fridays for Future as well. And this is also something that you mentioned in your book. And Tim, would you like to give us another message, not just in terms of hope? Would you like to give us another message, or do you want to make a final concluding remark?
Yeah. Ich denke, it's really interesting to me actually that when the journey of post-growth was a journey through life and thought, through the lives of ordinary people and sometimes extraordinary people, and the thoughts that they developed through their lives, that their life experience brought to them, the vision that they struggled for sometimes, like that vision of Lynn Margulis and Wangari Maathai. But the strength of that vision in providing us a resource for the future. And that's what I, in some sense, wanted the book to be, not a policy prescriptions, not what do policymakers do on Monday, but this extraordinary sense. And as I was writing, the sense of it came to me more and more clearly, and it's a very personal book in that sense, this sense of the force of the lives of those people and the extraordinary thought worlds that they lived in. And, in that sense, Hannah Arendt is a wonderful example of that. But it also struck me, and this is another sense of, hope for Germany. It struck me actually how many of those characters and thought worlds had their origins in the center of Europe and in the history of German thought over the ages, and how actually Germany held that idea of a kind of social market against the Anglo-centric version of competition. That there is a sense in which these thought worlds are like, for me, they're like a spring that's running under the soil that we can access, and they are inexhaustible because they create a vision for the future from which we can sustain ourselves. And I have a huge power, actually I have huge admiration in particular for all of the people in the book, but noticing in passing that quite a few of those characters had the start of their lives, at least inside a German culture. And I think that's, again, perhaps a leadership role that Germany can continue to play.
Vielen, vielen Dank, Tim. Also für mich ist eine Quelle der Hoffnung, wie viele Menschen.
Thank you very much. And for me also a source of hope is how many people have a different idea about how we can live together and must live together. There's so many people who have a different idea about the future and the good life. That such ideas are omnipresent everywhere in the world. They're universal. And let me say at the very end that I'm very happy that you mentioned Wangari Maathai as one of the pioneers. And you pay tribute to her, because Wangari Maathai, when she received the Peace Nobel Prize, she was also the award winner of the Petra Kelly Award of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. I knew her personally, and you're absolutely right. These are the personalities that can integrate people. And also a person like Margolis, she goes against the complete mainstream of science, the humanities. And she became known with her ideas. And we have to work on that. We have to believe in those ideas. And we need books as the one you've written, because they make us think. We do not just have to look for political descriptions. We have to think, we have to reflect, we have to embark on a quest, and I'm very happy to have you as one of our companions on that way forward. So I'd like to thank you very much for this conversation once again, and thanks for this invitation. And I hope we are going to meet again soon, because we are going to continue working on policy descriptions, and we also think about everyday life and the struggle. So all the best to you. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank our audience. Thanks for being with us tonight, and I wish you a pleasant, peaceful evening. Do read the book. It's absolutely worth reading. It was a pleasure for me to read it. It's inspiring. It's wonderfully written, very beautiful language, and a very good translation. And maybe our translator who translated the book is still with us and listens to us. So it's a pleasure. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon at the Foundation.